The first time the sky turned black over Bremen, Staff Sergeant Thomas Hale of Altoona, Pennsylvania, thought it was smoke from the oil tanks. He would later write in a small cloth-bound notebook, its edges stiff with frost and hydraulic grease, that the darkness did not roll in like the weather. Thickened, it gathered weight. It pressed downward as if the air itself had become iron. He was 23 years old, a waist gunner aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress flying in the 1st Air Division of the 8th Air Force, and by the winter of 1943 he had already learned the difference between fear and recognition. Fear came before a mission. Recognition came when you understood you were already inside it. That morning over northern Germany, recognition arrived first. The formation had crossed the Dutch coast at altitude, contrails stretching white and fragile behind hundreds of bombers in disciplined rows. From the ground, it must have looked like geometry, precise American industrial. From inside the aircraft, it felt like vibration and noise and metal fatigue. Hale's world existed between aluminum skin and sky. The waist windows were open despite the temperature, because the guns could not be trusted to fire through frost. At 25,000 feet, the cold was not simply cold. It was invasive. It reached through wool and leather and muscle. The slipstream clawed at his oxygen mask and tugged at his gloves until his fingers felt carved from wood. He remembered the smell most vividly. Oil, cordite residue from previous sorties, hot wiring, sweat frozen into canvas. And beneath it all, something metallic and faintly sweet. The scent of heated aluminum under stress. The pilot's voice came through the intercom in clipped fragments, steady but tight. The bomb ran in 12 minutes. Maintain formation. Watch your sectors. Hale turned his head and saw the first bursts of flak bloom beneath them. Small black flowers at first, delicate against the pale winter sky. Then more. Then dozens. The German anti-aircraft batteries around Bremen had been waiting. The city was not just another industrial target. It was a linchpin. Shipyards along the Weser River. Submarine pens reinforced with concrete thick enough to defy ordinary bomb loads. Factories that fed steel into the Reichsmachinery. Bremen mattered. And the Germans understood that if the Americans came in daylight, they would pay for every mile. The black flowers thickened into walls. Flak was not fire in the conventional sense. It was mathematics weaponized. Shells timed to detonate at precise altitudes. Steel fragments traveling faster than thought. Hale watched as the sky around the formation became textured. Dark bursts layered upon one another until the air looked contaminated. The sunlight dimmed not because clouds had formed, but because explosives had turned air into debris. He would write later. It was as if someone had poured coal dust into the heavens. The aircraft jolted. A concussion rolled through the fuselage and rattled his teeth. Somewhere forward, a fragment struck. He did not know where. He did not need to. He gripped the twin .50 caliber Brownings and scanned his ARC. German fighters would follow the flak. They always did. The Luftwaffe preferred to let artillery tear holes in formations before sending in Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs to finish off the wounded. Inside the B-17 no one shouted. Training held them together. Hale felt the aircraft shudder again. Closer this time. Shards of something clanged against the interior wall. He thought briefly of Altoona, of rail yards and smokestacks, of his father's hands stained black from years on the line. He had grown up watching steel shaped into motion. Now he sat inside another product of American steel, suspended over enemy territory, trusting rivets and engines and men he barely knew. The bombers ahead of them began to vanish into the blackness. Not disappear, simply swallowed by layered bursts of flak that obscured depth perception. The sky over Bremen no longer felt like space. Felt enclosed. The formation tightened instinctively, aircraft wingtip to wingtip, trusting the doctrine drilled into them. Cohesion meant survival. Lone bombers died. A burst detonated just off their right wing. The aircraft dropped several feet before the pilot corrected. Hale's headset crackled with a voice he recognized. The ball turret gunner reporting hydraulic pressure fluctuations. Calm. Clinical. The language of systems failing in increments. Another explosion. Another tremor. The waist compartment filled briefly with a metallic haze. powdered insulation shaken loose from somewhere above. He saw it then. A B-17 in the adjacent squadron took a direct hit. The explosion did not resemble cinema. There was no dramatic fireball. Instead, the aircraft simply ruptured, its midsection torn open as if by invisible claws. Men fell. Small, dark shapes against a sky that had already turned black. Parachutes did not open in time. The formation adjusted, sliding inward to close the gap. Discipline over grief. Hale did not look away for long. He could not afford to. His sector demanded attention. The Germans understood angles. They would approach from sun glare, from blind spots, from any direction not covered by overlapping fire. The first fighters appeared as silhouettes slicing through flak. Long noses, yellow markings. They came head-on, cannons flashing. He fired without thinking. The Brownings bucked in rhythm, empty casings spinning past his boots and vanishing into the slipstream. Tracer rounds stitched orange lines through the darkness. One German fighter rolled away trailing smoke. Another continued, closing distance until Hale could see the pilot's helmeted head. The fighter's guns flashed. Plexiglass exploded inward beside him, fragments slicing through his sleeve. He did not feel pain. Not yet. The sky had fully turned. Smoke from ruptured aircraft mixed with flak residue and engine exhaust until the air above Bremen resembled industrial fog. Visibility collapsed into yards rather than miles. Bombers flew through turbulence created not by weather but by destruction. Hale's world shrank to vibration, recoil, breath measured through rubber and oxygen. He would later write that in that moment, suspended inside blackened sky, he understood something fundamental. The war had become industrial in the truest sense. Not just factories and assembly lines, but destruction produced at scale. The Germans had turned air into shrapnel. The Americans had turned aluminum into armadas. Bremen was where those systems collided. The bombardier's voice cut through the intercom. Bomb bay doors open. The aircraft shifted as drag increased. Hale felt the cold deepen. For a few seconds, the guns were irrelevant. Now it was altitude, speed, and timing. Below them, unseen through smoke and flak, lay shipyards and submarine pens and rail spurs feeding war deeper into Europe. Bombs away. The B-17 lurched upward, lighter by thousands of pounds. The formation banked slightly, beginning the long, exposed turn away from target. This was the most dangerous phase. Predictable trajectory. Slower speed. Fighters would press hardest now. Hale kept firing. The sky over Bremen remained black long after the bombs fell. And in his notebook, weeks later, when the adrenaline had drained and the frostbite in his fingers had begun to ache in warmer air, he wrote a single line beneath that day's entry. The sky did not darken because of the weather. It darkened because we decided it must. The darkness over Bremen did not lift when the bombs fell. If anything, it thickened, as though the sky resented what had just passed through it. Hale would later describe the outbound leg as more terrifying than the approach, because on the way in there was still purpose ahead. On the way out, there was only survival. The formation had done its work. Now it had to endure the consequence of it. German gunners recalibrated. Fighter squadrons adjusted angles. The industrial heart below them had not been silenced. It had been provoked. The B-17 shuddered again, more violently this time. A sharp metallic crack rang through the fuselage, followed by the sudden howl of altered airflow. Hale smelled it immediately. Burning insulation. Not flame yet, just heat where it did not belong. He twisted at the waist and saw a thin gray ribbon curling from somewhere near the radio compartment. The intercom crackled with overlapping voices, engine 2 fluctuating, hydraulics reading erratic, tail gunner reporting limited traverse on his right arc. There is a particular stillness that descends inside a damaged aircraft at altitude. It is not quiet. Engines still roar, guns still hammer, but something in the human rhythm shifts. Movements become deliberate. Words shrink. Every man begins calculating his own probability without admitting it. Hale adjusted his gloves, flexed fingers that no longer felt attached to him, and kept scanning his sector. German fighters were regrouping. They came from below this time, A formation of Focke-Wulf 190s rose through the thinning smoke at an angle designed to exploit the bomber's blind cones. Hale pivoted, braced, and fired short, controlled bursts. He had learned that panic emptied ammunition faster than courage. Tracers arced downward. One fighter rolled left, overshooting. Another climbed toward the belly of a bomber ahead and unleashed a cannon burst that shattered its wing root. The aircraft dipped once, as though bowing, then fell away trailing flame. No one inside Hale's crew spoke. They did not need to. The smoke in their own fuselage thickened. The radio operator shouted that the small fire was contained, extinguisher discharged, wiring scorched but not fully compromised. Hale felt relief register only as a change in breathing. He had imagined, in the early days of training in England, that fear would arrive as a dramatic wave. Instead, it lived in small adjustments, the tightening of jaw muscles, the way his shoulders never fully relaxed. Below them, through breaks in smoke, Hale glimpsed Bremen for the first time since the run began. Columns of black rose from shipyards along the river. Something large burned near the docks, fuel storage perhaps, or a rail yard. The bomb pattern had been tight. The bombardier would be satisfied. But satisfaction meant nothing at 25,000 feet. Damage on the ground did not shield aluminum from steel fragments in the air. Another explosion ripped near the tail. The aircraft yawed sharply. The tail gunner cursed, then corrected himself. The elevator controls sluggishness. Hale felt the subtle imbalance through his boots. They were no longer flying inside perfect formation geometry. They were flying inside compromise. The German fighters pressed closer now, emboldened by damaged bombers drifting from the group. Hale saw one peel off toward a crippled aircraft trailing fuel vapor. The Luftwaffe pilot did not fire immediately. He positioned carefully, conserving ammunition. Then a single burst. The American bomber ignited in full flame. Hale caught a glimpse of a parachute opening this time, white against black, before smoke swallowed the rest. His ammunition counter ran low. He swapped belts with stiff hands, fingers fumbling against frozen metal. A casing bounced against his cheek and lodged briefly against his oxygen mask before tumbling away. He tasted copper and realized he had bitten his lip without noticing. Inside the aircraft, systems stabilized just enough to continue. Engine 2 steadied. The fire was out, but altitude had dropped several hundred feet. At that height, small losses accumulated. German gunners recalculated again. Flak bursts began appearing at slightly lower brackets. The formation ahead thinned. What had been rows upon rows of bombers on the inbound leg was now fractured. Gaps where aircraft had once flown left empty corridors in the sky. Hale felt something close to anger at those spaces. They represented men he had seen at breakfast, men who had joked about powdered eggs and English tea. Another fighter closed head-on. This one came through flak like a blade through fabric, cannons firing in disciplined bursts. Hale and the top turret gunner converged fire, their tracers crossing. The German aircraft shuddered, dipped, and rolled away trailing smoke but did not fall. It vanished into the black haze below, fate unresolved. Time stretched. Minutes over target felt like hours. The outbound leg toward the North Sea required endurance measured not in distance but in sustained alertness. Hale's shoulders burned from recoil and tension. His lower back throbbed from bracing against turbulence. The cold had seeped past numbness into a deeper ache that felt structural. He thought again of Altoona, of snow falling softly on tracks that carried freight east and west without interruption. He had once believed industry was noise and smoke. Now he understood it as repetition. The Germans would rebuild what they could. The Americans would return. Aluminum would cross oceans again. Steel would detonate in air again. Bremen was not an event. It was part of a cycle. The coastline appeared faintly ahead, gray against darker gray. Crossing back over water always carried a different kind of relief. Not safety, German fighters could follow far, but a psychological line had been drawn. They were leaving the heart of the Reich behind them. The last serious attack came just before the Dutch coast. A coordinated pass by multiple fighters aimed at stragglers. Hale's aircraft, slightly lower and slower than ideal, drew attention. A burst of cannon fire tore through the left wing, puncturing a fuel tank. Vapor streamed outward. The engineer shouted readings, pressure dropping but manageable. Hale fired until the barrels of his Brownings shimmered with heat. He saw one fighter disintegrate mid-roll, wing shearing off. Another peeled away. Then, abruptly, the sky lightened. Not fully clear. Smoke still lingered, but the density of flak thinned. Fighters disengaged. The black over Bremen remained behind them like a bruise on the horizon. Inside the B-17, voices shifted tone. Not jubilant, not triumphant, merely less taut. Damage reports circulated. No fatalities aboard. Minor wounds. One deep cut along Hale's forearm where plexiglass had sliced through wool and flesh. He had not felt it until now. Blood had frozen along the edge of his sleeve. He looked back once more. The sky over Bremen remained darker than the surrounding winter air, a layered stain of smoke and explosive residue. It would dissipate by evening. The city would smolder. Repair crews would emerge. German families would count damage in brick and bone. Hale turned forward again. The engines droned toward England. The war had not ended. The mission had not even concluded. Landing would bring its own risks, crosswinds, damaged hydraulics, exhausted reflexes. But for the moment, the black sky receded behind them. In his notebook, he would later add a second line beneath the first. We left pieces of ourselves in that darkness. The North Sea never looked welcoming, but on that afternoon it appeared almost merciful. The water lay beneath them in a dull sheet of pewter, broken only by thin streaks of white where wind sheared across its surface. After the industrial violence over Bremen, the emptiness felt unnatural. There were no searchlights here, no rising bursts of flak, no spirals of fighters climbing toward them. Only distance, only cold, only the steady vibration of 4 Wright Cyclone engines dragging a wounded machine toward England. Inside the B-17, the crew shifted from combat reflex to mechanical survival. The engineer moved down the narrow fuselage checking hydraulic lines, glancing at gauges, calculating fuel burn against the punctured tank. The radio operator rewired a scorched section of insulation with hands that trembled only when idle. The navigator recalculated drift corrections. The aircraft was no longer holding optimal altitude or speed. Every small imperfection multiplied over open water. Hale eased back from his guns for the first time in hours. The twin barrels of the Browning .50s were streaked black and silver from heat cycling. The metal carried a faint burnt sweetness, the smell of cordite and friction. His forearms trembled, not from fear but from sustained recoil. He flexed his fingers and felt the deep ache of impact travel into bone. Combat left no dramatic signature in the moment. It registered later as fatigue that seemed to live inside the joints. The tail gunner's voice came faint through the intercom. No contacts. It sounded almost suspicious, as though he did not trust the quiet either. Hale allowed himself one controlled breath. The oxygen mask still pressed against his face, drying his lips. He lifted it briefly to wipe the blood from his forearm. The cut was clean, shallow but long, likely from the fractured plexiglass panel that had cracked during the last fighter pass. The cold had slowed the bleeding. He wrapped it in gauze without comment. Over the sea, perspective returned. He thought about the bomb run again, not with pride, not with regret, but with analysis. The grouping had been tight. The lead bombardier had held formation steady under fire. Bremen's shipyards had been a priority target for months. Submarines and supply vessels moved through that port. Destroying industrial capacity was not theatrical. It was arithmetic. Fewer ships meant fewer torpedoes in the Atlantic. Fewer torpedoes meant more convoys reaching Britain. Hale had come to understand the war as a chain of logistical equations, each solved through steel. And yet, the blackness he had seen over the city lingered in his mind differently than previous missions. It had not been merely smoke. It had been density, a concentration of destruction so complete that daylight struggled against it. He wondered how it looked from the ground. Did German civilians stare upward as the sky dimmed? Did they understand that the darkness was not weather, but consequence? He did not dwell there long. In the air, Sentiment wasted focus. A sudden shudder ran through the fuselage. Engine 2 coughed, one hard misfire, then resumed. The engineer's voice sharpened. Oil pressure fluctuates. Hale felt the aircraft dip slightly on the left side. The pilot adjusted throttle carefully, balancing output. They were still hours from their English base. If Engine 2 failed completely, they would lose lift asymmetrically. Over water, that meant ditching. Survival odds in the North Sea in winter were thin. The crew did not panic. They recalibrated. Hale rotated briefly with the top turret gunner, giving each other moments to stretch cramped muscles. When he settled back into position, the horizon ahead had shifted tone. A faint brightness, subtle but real, cut through the gray. England lay somewhere beyond that line. The radio operator began picking up friendlier signals. Recognition codes. Brief bursts of RAF chatter. The pilot acknowledged with clipped replies. Each voice carried exhaustion masked by discipline. Hale glanced at the formation remnants. Where there had once been dozens of bombers, now perhaps half remained within visual range. Some trailed faint smoke. Others flew lower, lagging. The empty spaces between them felt accusatory. He remembered one aircraft in particular, the bomber that had bowed midair and dropped away in flame. He had known no names from that crew, but he had seen their machine often in formation. Painted nose art, something humorous, incongruous against the seriousness of the task. He tried to recall it now but could not. Memory sometimes protects itself by blurring. The English coast emerged slowly, like a promise kept reluctantly. Pale cliffs, a thin, wavering line of land that grew into fields and roads and airstrips hidden behind camouflage netting. Hale felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief exactly, but a temporary suspension of inevitability. Landing would test them differently. The pilot lowered the flaps cautiously. Hydraulic pressure remained borderline but sufficient. The punctured fuel tank had stabilized. Enough remained to reach base. Engine 2 held, though unevenly. The runway approached, long, straight, framed by dispersal huts and ground crews waiting in parkas against the wind. Hale secured his guns, locking them into safe positions. His arms felt heavier now than during combat. Adrenaline drained quickly once purpose shifted. The touchdown was rough. The damaged hydraulic system made braking unpredictable. The aircraft veered slightly before correcting. Tires screeched against frozen tarmac. Finally, the B-17 rolled to a halt in a plume of exhaust and cold air. Silence inside the fuselage was immediate and strange. Engines wound down. Vibrations ceased. The absence of mechanical noise felt louder than flak. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft, shouting questions up toward the cockpit. Hale unlatched his harness slowly, standing on legs that felt borrowed. When he stepped onto the ladder and descended to the runway, the cold hit differently. Damp, English, almost gentle compared to altitude. He looked back at the aircraft. The left wing bore jagged holes. The fuselage skin was punctured in multiple places. Plexiglass in the nose had spidered outward from impact points. Black streaks ran along the belly where fire had licked and died. The B-17 had returned, but not untouched. Intelligence officers waited near the dispersal hut. Debrief would begin immediately. Flak concentrations, fighter tactics, bomb pattern accuracy. Hale knew the routine. He would describe the sky turning black. He would estimate burst density. He would note the timing of fighter waves. His words would become data, stripped of sensation. But in his notebook later that night, he would write differently. He would describe the smell of burning insulation, the weight of the guns, the way the darkness over Bremen felt almost solid. He would note the silence over the sea and the fragile mercy of the coastline. He would not write about fear. He would write about repetition, because he understood something now that he had not during training in Pennsylvania. The black sky over Bremen was not a single moment of terror. It was a symbol of scale. Industry against industry. Nation against nation. Smoke rising not just from factories, but from systems colliding. He sat on a wooden crate outside the dispersal hut while mechanics examined the aircraft. Other crews moved nearby, some silent, some talking too quickly. An ambulance idled near the far runway. Not every bomber had returned intact. Hale touched the edge of his bandaged forearm and felt the dull pulse beneath. He was alive. So were the men who had flown beside him. For today, that was enough. But the sky over Germany would darken again. And he would return to it. Debrief began before the engine metal had fully cooled. Inside the low-timbered hut near the dispersal line, maps covered every wall. Europe pinned with colored string, grease pencil arcs, bomb pattern overlays, flak density circles drawn in black and red. A long wooden table ran down the center of the room. Intelligence officers sat at one end, sleeves rolled, pencils sharpened, expressions clinical. They were not interested in fear or heroics. They wanted altitude, timing, bearing, enemy strength, deviation. Hale sat with his crew, helmet resting beside his boots, oxygen mask draped loosely around his neck. Steam still lifted faintly from his flight jacket as his body adjusted from high-altitude cold to English damp. His hands felt oddly detached from him, as if the guns had never quite released their grip. Time over target? The intelligence captain asked. 1,400 hours, the pilot answered. Flak concentration? Severe. Heaviest at initial point. Box barrage from the west side of yards. Burst altitude matched us within 200 feet. The captain nodded without emotion and marked it on the map. Another officer circled Bremen in red and wrote a number beside it. Numbers accumulated faster than stories. When it came to Hale, he described what he saw from the waist position. Fighters came in low, climbed through smoke. FW-190s. 3 passes starboard. 1 direct approach from the rear. Heavy cannon. Likely 20 millimeters. 1 Me-109 high cover but didn't engage close. Estimated number? Hard to say through smoke. 6 confirmed in close contact. Possibly more outside formation. The pencil scratched. More red arcs. And visibility? The captain asked. Hale hesitated only a fraction. Poor. Smoke thickened after the first wave. By the second pass, the sky was nearly black over yards. The officer glanced up briefly at that phrasing. Nearly black. Yes, sir. He did not elaborate. He did not describe how the darkness had swallowed daylight, how it felt like flying through the inside of a furnace chimney. He did not describe how even the flak bursts had begun to disappear into it, flashes muffled by their own consequence. The debrief lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, the men stood slowly, shoulders curved forward not from defeat, but from cumulative weight. They filed out into the cold air without speaking much. Each carried the same private calculation, the number of aircraft that had not landed. Hale walked past the row of hardstands. Several bombers stood scarred like his own. One was missing its tail assembly entirely, propped awkwardly for assessment. Another had a wing panel shredded as though by giant claws. Mechanics worked methodically, replacing panels, patching holes with aluminum sheets riveted into place. Nothing was permanent. Everything was reparable until it wasn't. In the mess hall that evening, the air was heavy with boiled cabbage and coffee. Men ate quietly. Some laughed too loudly at trivial remarks. Others stared at trays without appetite. On the far wall, a chalkboard listed missions completed. A new tally mark had been added. Hale sat with his back to the wall as he always did. He preferred to see the room. The habit had followed him from childhood hunting trips in Pennsylvania, when his father had insisted on awareness as instinct. Always know what's behind you, his father used to say. Now the phrase held darker utility. Across from him sat the navigator, hands still faintly shaking as he held his coffee tin. We lost 3, the navigator said quietly. Hale nodded. 4th Squadron's down 1-2. The arithmetic expanded. After dinner, Hale returned to the barracks hut assigned to his crew. The room smelled faintly of damp wool and boot polish. Each bunk held a footlocker beneath it, personal items folded inside, letters, photographs, a shaving kit, a Bible or paperback novel. Normal objects arranged inside abnormal context. He retrieved his notebook from his locker. It was not regulation. Official after-action reports were dictated and filed. This book was his own. Brown leather cover, edges worn. Inside, dates written neatly along margins. Observations without flourish. He sat on the lower bunk and began writing. February 1944. Bremen. Smoke thicker than any prior target. Visibility reduced mid-mission. Flak accurate. Fighters aggressive. The sky darkened near night. He paused. The words felt insufficient. He continued. Industrial damage appears significant. Shipyard structures impacted directly. Fires visible across the eastern quadrant. Enemy resistance concentrated but not disorganized. Again insufficient. He stopped pretending he was writing for posterity and wrote for himself. The sky did not fade, it collapsed. The sun disappeared into man-made weather. It felt like flying into a tunnel built from smoke. Noise constant. Guns are hot. Smell of burned wiring. Thought briefly that this is what extinction might look like if scaled upward. He stared at that last line. Extinction. He did not cross it out. Outside, wind moved through the airfield, rattling loose tin along a storage shed. Somewhere in the distance, an engine coughed to life. Another bomber repositioning for maintenance. Hale closed the notebook and lay back on the bunk, boots still on. Sleep would not come quickly. Missions imprinted themselves first. The mind replayed bursts of flak in unpredictable order. The sudden bloom of cannon fire. The aircraft that fell away in flames. He saw again the black sky over Bremen. He thought of the men below, German workers, dockhands, naval crews, clerks in offices adjacent to the yards. Did they run when the sirens began? Did they look up at the incoming formations and measure their odds? Did they also feel the sky collapse? The war at altitude created distance that ground soldiers never possessed. He had never seen a German face close enough to recognize fear. Only aircraft silhouettes, mechanical and impersonal. And yet the destruction was intimate in consequence. He rolled onto his side and stared at the thin wooden wall beside his bunk. The grain in the timber traced irregular lines like rivers on a map. He imagined Germany beneath that black sky, cities arranged like coordinates on those intelligence maps, each one destined to darken. He understood something now with greater clarity. What they were doing over Bremen was not tactical harassment. It was systematic dismantling. Steel against steel. Production lines turned into ash. The sky itself weaponized. And it would not stop. The next target would come within days. Perhaps Hamburg. Perhaps Leipzig. Perhaps Berlin itself. Each mission is a repetition of the same pattern. Climb, cross the sea, penetrate flak, endure fighters, release bombs, escape if possible. He turned back onto his back and closed his eyes. In the dark behind his eyelids, the sky was still black. 3 days later, they were back in the air. The mission board in the operations hut had revealed the next target at dawn. Hamburg. The word had carried weight even before the briefing began. Hamburg was not merely a city. It was Germany's second-largest port, a naval artery, a shipbuilding center, a warehouse of fuel, machinery, and men. It was also a symbol. The previous summer, the British had burned it in firestorms so intense that entire neighborhoods had liquefied. Now the Americans would return to it in daylight. The briefing room smelled of chalk, dust, and sweat. A red curtain was pulled back to reveal the map. The colonel pointed with a wooden stick as he spoke in measured cadence. Primary target, Blohm and Voss shipyards. Secondary, oil storage east of harbor. Heavy flak expected. Fighter presence confirmed. Intelligence estimates reinforced units in the area after recent night raids. A murmur ran through the room. Not fear exactly, but recognition. Hamburg meant density. Flak batteries layered over one another. Interlocking arcs. Barges timed to altitude. Hale sat upright, pencil poised above his notebook. He wrote coordinates, headings, and estimated wind drift. He did not write what he was thinking. Hamburg meant the sky would burn again. By mid-morning, the runway trembled as engines roared to life in sequence. Hale climbed through the fuselage to his waist gun position. metal cold beneath his boots. He checked ammunition belts by touch, oxygen line connection, headset wire. Outside the open waist window, frost clung to the wing. Takeoff was routine until it wasn't. The bomber ahead of them lifted too slowly, tail dipping dangerously before stabilizing. For a split second, Hale imagined it cartwheeling across the runway, flame swallowing aluminum before the mission even began. But it rose cleanly, and their own wheels followed seconds later. They formed over the English coast in tight geometry. Sunlight flashed off dozens of wings. It was almost beautiful in abstraction. Precision flight, synchronized ascent, contrails carving white lines into blue. Then they crossed the channel. Cloud cover thinned as they approached the German coastline. Smoke already lingered faintly on the horizon. Residue from prior raids, from factories that never quite stopped burning. Flak expected within 5 minutes. The pilot's voice crackled through Hale's headset. The first bursts appeared ahead, black flowers blooming against the pale sky. Then more. Then entire curtains of them. Hamburg's defenses were not tentative. They were layered like armor. The aircraft jolted as the first shockwave struck. Not a direct hit, but close enough to rattle ribs and teeth. Hale braced his boots and leaned into the gun. Through his sight, he saw the harbor unfolding below. Ships moored along piers, cranes frozen in silhouette, rail lines feeding warehouses like veins. Then the smoke began again. It rose not only from previous damage but from new impacts as the lead squadrons released their loads. Explosions erupted in clusters. Oil tanks ignited in sequence, each one adding to the density above the city. Within minutes, the sky over Hamburg thickened into the same oppressive darkness he had recorded at Bremen. "Fighters! 2 o'clock high!" someone shouted. They came through the smoke like predators, FW-190s angular and purposeful. One dove straight at Hale's side of the formation. He squeezed the trigger and felt the gun vibrate violently in his hands. Tracers streaked outward, red against blackened air. The fighter veered, then rolled beneath them. A second approached from below, climbing steeply, cannons flashing. The bomber ahead of Hale's aircraft erupted in sparks along its wing route. For a terrifying moment, flame licked across its fuselage, but it held formation. Hale kept firing, bursts disciplined despite adrenaline clawing at his throat. He saw one German aircraft bank too slowly after its pass. Another gunner's tracers intersected it. The fighter tilted, trailed smoke, and disappeared into the churning haze. The formation pressed forward. Bomb bay doors opened beneath them. The sudden drop in vibration was noticeable even from Hale's position. The bombardier's calm voice counted down. Steady, steady, bombs away. The aircraft lurched slightly upward as thousands of pounds of ordnance released into the void. Hale leaned outward as far as his harness allowed and watched them fall. Small black shapes vanishing into smoke. Moments later, the city answered. A rolling concussion surged upward through the cloud layer. Fire blossomed in rapid succession. The oil storage fields became torches. Ships rocked violently in harbor. Entire blocks seemed to shudder and dissolve. The smoke thickened so completely that sunlight failed again. It was not twilight. It was obliteration. Inside that darkness, Flak continued blindly. Bursts detonated almost at random, guided by sound and radar. One exploded so close to Hale's position that metal fragments sliced through the open waist. Something struck his shoulder and spun him sideways. He gasped, instinctively checking for blood. The fragment had cut through his flight jacket but lodged in the bulkhead behind him. He felt warmth along his arm but no catastrophic pain. "Waist okay?" the pilot demanded. "Still firing," Hale answered. He did not mention the trembling in his hands. The return leg was worse. German fighters regrouped beyond the heaviest smoke and harried the formation as it turned west. One bomber below them lost an engine entirely, propeller frozen at grotesque angle. It drifted downward slowly, unable to maintain altitude. Hale watched it fall away, watched 2 parachutes bloom, then vanish into clouds. He did not know if the crew would survive landing, capture, or the impact itself. The channel appeared at last, gray and indifferent beneath them. Only then did the flak cease entirely. Only then did silence creep back into the cabin between bursts of engine noise. They landed mid-afternoon. 2 aircraft from their group did not. In the debriefing hut, intelligence officers noted damage to the Blome and Voss yard as significant. Oil storage destruction confirmed. Enemy fighter resistance moderate to heavy. No one recorded the quality of the darkness. That night, Hale wrote again in his notebook. Hamburg, smoke beyond prior scale. Fire fed by fuel reserves. The city is engulfed. Flak indiscriminate within clouds. Shoulder struck by a fragment minor. He paused, then added, "This is not a battle in the conventional sense. It is erosion. Steel eroding steel. The sky is no longer sky over major targets, transformed into an atmosphere of ash." He closed the book slowly. The black sky was no longer singular to Bremen. It was spreading. The last entry in Harold Hale's memoir was not written over Germany. It was written months later in a hospital ward outside Norwich, under a window that looked out over hedgerows instead of burning cities. He had survived Bremen. He had survived Hamburg. He had survived 9 more missions over industrial Germany as winter tightened its grip and the Reich's defenses grew more desperate. He had watched the Luftwaffe thin. He had watched Flak grow less precise as fuel and coordination failed. He had watched formations that once lost 6 bombers lose only 1. He had watched the sky slowly reclaim its blue. What he did not survive intact was the 10th mission after Hamburg. March 1944. Target: aircraft assembly plants near Brunswick. The weather is poor. Visibility intermittent. The formation had flown through cloud cover most of the approach, emerging briefly into pale sunlight just as German fighters broke through the mist. The attack was sudden, coordinated, and low. 1 FW-190 slipped beneath their bomber and fired upward at near point-blank range. The first burst tore through the bomb bay. The second ignited fuel vapor. Hale never described the explosion in technical detail. He did not recount the trajectory of the aircraft, nor the angle of descent. He wrote only this: "The world went white before it went black." He regained consciousness on the ground, in snow. His parachute had deployed. His left leg had not. It was the waist position that had taken the brunt of the blast. Shrapnel had shredded the fuselage. The force of the detonation had torn metal inward like claws. When Hale hit the ground, German soldiers were already running toward the crash site behind him. 2 of his crew lay still in the wreckage. 1 crawled. The rest were unaccounted for. He was captured within the hour. He would spend 13 months in a prisoner-of-war camp in northern Germany, behind barbed wire, in huts that smelled of damp straw and coal smoke. He would watch Allied aircraft pass overhead daily, sometimes hundreds at a time, contrails stitching across the sky in endless procession. He would hear distant bomb blasts rolling across the horizon like thunder without rain. And every time the sky darkened with smoke from another industrial city, he would remember Bremen. He wrote in his memoir that captivity clarified something he had not understood in the air. From the ground, he saw what the German civilians saw. He saw columns of smoke rising miles away. He saw refugees moving along frozen roads with carts and children. He saw rail lines severed, bridges twisted, factories reduced to skeletal frames. He saw not only the collapse of military infrastructure but the unraveling of daily life. He did not romanticize it. He did not condemn it either. He wrote, "War at altitude is geometry. War on the ground is a consequence." When Allied forces reached his camp in April 1945, the guards had already fled. The gates stood open. American infantry arrived cautious and thin, their uniforms faded by months of winter combat. Hale limped toward them on a makeshift crutch fashioned from a broken bunk board. The sky above the camp was clear. Clear in a way he had not seen since before Bremen. He returned to Pennsylvania that autumn with a cane and a box of papers, letters from home, fragments of maps, and the notebook he had carried through fire and capture. He did not speak much about the missions. When neighbors asked what it had been like to bomb Germany, he answered simply, "It was loud." But in private, he continued to write. In the final pages of his memoir, completed in 1953 and found after his death by his granddaughter, he returned to that first blackened sky over Bremen. He described the way smoke erased direction, how it removed horizon, sun, reference points, how it forced men to rely on training rather than instinct, how it made courage mechanical, almost procedural. Then he wrote something unexpected. The sky turned black that day not only because factories burned. It turned black because industry met industry at full force. The Germans had built a war machine with steel and discipline. We answered with more steel, more machines, more repetition. The sky was the place where that equation became visible. He did not frame it as triumph. He framed it as inevitability. Once the factories began running without pause, he wrote, the outcome was arithmetic. By 1944, American industry was producing aircraft faster than Germany could replace them. Bomber crews were rotating through missions in numbers that would have seemed impossible in 1942. Radar improved. Fighter escorts extended range. The daylight sky over Germany became less a contested space and more a conveyor belt of destruction. Bremen was not the decisive blow. Nor was Hamburg. Nor Brunswick. It was the accumulation. Sortie after sortie. Contrail after contrail. Factory after factory. The sky did not turn black once. It turned black repeatedly, methodically, until the Reich's capacity to fight at scale collapsed under its own smoke. Harold Hale never called himself a hero. He never described the gun in his hands as anything but equipment. He never wrote about killing. He wrote about patterns, about logistics, about the feeling of altitude and vibration and metal trembling under stress. He understood, perhaps more clearly than most, that what broke German morale in 1944 was not a single squadron or a single battle. It was the realization that the darkness would return tomorrow. And the day after that. And the day after that. The sky over Bremen was not merely a battlefield. It was a forecast. When Hale died in 1988, his memoir remained unpublished. It did not contain soaring speeches or cinematic bravado. It contained coordinates, temperatures, mechanical observations, and quiet reflections on smoke. Yet within those pages lies one of the clearest human records of industrial war ever written, not from a general's desk or a statesman's podium, but from a waist gun position at 25,000 feet. The found memoirs of a Pennsylvania gunner do not glorify the sky turning black over Bremen. They explain it, and in explaining it, they reveal the deeper truth of the air war over Europe. The darkness was never accidental. It was engineered.